I welcome you back to our examination ongoing within the Gospel and pages of the Gospel of Matthew. We will find ourselves here looking at Matthew chapter 26. I'm going to be reading out of the Norley translation of the New Testament. Let's see, in the bottom left corner is the copyright information there. Norley translation in a Bible, New Testament, I should say. Matthew chapter 26, beginning at verse 7. While he was at the table there, a woman came up to him with a bottle of very costly perfume and poured it on his head. When the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why such waste? The ointment could have been sold at a great price and given to the poor." We live in a world where there is always a problem that we must fix. Now, spare me a few moments to give one of my favorite political rants. One of my favorite political rants is how governance in the Western world, and in particular within democracies, has become obsessed with the need to fix everything that is out there. We feel the need and the requirement of our government is to fix our social fabric. Now, there are 2 points to be kept in mind here. On the one hand, I'm not saying that the world we have is as good as we can get. I'm not trying to be naive to that and say that, you know what, we just simply need to ignore every problem out there. That's not my point. In other words, I'm not saying that there are problems out there that we can ignore. What I'm saying, and this gets to the second point, is that governments can find a way to legitimize themselves and what they do by always fixating themselves on a problem that is out there. And one of the problems within governance in democracies in the Western world is that we become obsessed on the need to fix social problems, not problems dealing with our infrastructure, not problems dealing with a governance, not problems with dealing with accountability, but social problems. In other words, what we have done is embarked on a road that with no end in sight, because there's always some sort of social problem that the government can step in and tinker with. The problem with what we are doing is we are going down a road, as it were, the road we are going down on, as we are creating major problems for a future generation. The classic example is this. In 1980, the government in China enacted the one-child policy, and that was in place in China in 2013. Now, what is the problem when you intervene into social problems and think that you have an enlightened vision and do not really see things for what they are? You create future problems. What happened in China is, and in part, it's a reflection of their cultural heritage. When that is said and done, they are not unique in this. If they had to have one child, that in effect meant for a lot of families, it was a one son policy, because in Chinese culture, the son was of more value and importance. Again, I'm not going to castigate the Chinese people for this. A lot of cultures, East and West, looked at things in the same way, would do the same thing in that sort of situation. So when China finally abandoned the policy in 2013, they created a situation in which there is a massive distortion in their population, because over 30 plus years, they created a situation in which more boys than girls were born. Their desire and zeal to intervene in a social issue created all sorts of future social problems. Our zeal for same-sex marriages and abortions, whether we like it or not, is going to create long-term social problems in which another generation is going to have to come in and clean up our mess. How is it going to impact our society? I don't know, but we just know you mess with social problems by governments and you are going to have long-term problems. Of course, it's going to be long after these elected officials are going to have to deal with an election. They'll be long gone. And the problem, of course, in the Western world is our obsession on social problems often comes at the basis of what government should be about. Build our bridges, build our roads, the basic infrastructures that need to be in place, or good governance, or accountability and governance, fairness in the tax system, so on and so forth. Now, obviously, I kind of lean like anybody with political views one way or the other. What I'm trying to be here is not be liberal or conservative. Try as I might, I'm probably not. I'm willing to take pot shots at both sides, as it were. The question at this point is, what does this political rant have to do with our passage here? Well, think about it. Read this passage in and through the lens of modern Western governance in our democracies. The disciples are in this passage are about as modern as you can get. They are raising objections about this lavish display of adoration by this woman. Did she not get it that we could have used this to alleviate world hunger and inner city poverty? Jesus in Matthew says in verse 11 of chapter 26, you're always going to have the poor with you. Here is the rub. Here is the problem with trying to correct every social problem out there. You will always have the poor. Now, how can we make the leap from poverty to sexual inequality? The reason is that the fundamental problem is the same. You see, if you interpret poverty as an economic issue, what you do is you seek to tinker with wages or taxation or. In other words, it's an economic problem, pure and simple, and you push the right button, pull the right lever, so on and so forth, and you will alleviate poverty. What Jesus is pointing to and trying to get us to understand is that poverty is ultimately, in many cases, not just an economic issue. It is an issue as the result of poor choices, morally and otherwise, made by some people. In some societies, poverty is an outcome, a systematic discrimination of one segment versus another. In other words, what I'm saying is that on one level, the poor is not an economic issue. It is not a social issue that we can just pull a plunger, push a button, flick a lever, whatever. You see, poverty will exist as long as sin does. People become alcoholics, drug addicts. People have children before they are married or ready. The point is not to castigate these people, but to recognize that there's a side of the social issues which are related to sin. And governments that try to embark on the rule of making society good, well, and perfect are doomed to make catastrophic mistakes that other generations are going to have to deal with. The ignoring of sin is why, in our zeal to deal with social problems, we are creating further problems. In effect, what we are doing is putting ourselves on the pedestal and saying, look how good we are. We are doing something wonderful and good. And in the blindness, fail to see that we are creating the most basic of sin, which is pride. Jesus was not a bleeding heart liberal, or for that matter, a staunch conservative. Jesus knew if you did not deal with the heart, you will never, ever change the world for the better.